Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And because you've been involved in so many of these campaigns, and SEIU particularly has been a leader across the country, you guys have been involved in some of the successful campaigns for 15. So some of the arguments against raising the wage to $15 an hour, or even raising it this quickly, or, you know, there's always the same thing, whether it's the fast food industry or just the retail economy, that it's going to contribute to tremendous job loss. It's going to affect the workers who can least afford to lose the job. That, in other words, if I have to pay this much money, I'm going to want workers with more experience and more education. I'm not going to take a chance on that single mother or that, you know, at-risk youth. But there's been evidence now in other cities. So what's been the experience in places like Seattle or San Francisco where they've gone through this already? Has the sky literally fallen?
The sky has not literally fallen. You know, those cities have adjusted. Now, EJ characterized Seattle as an exceptional city in the country. I actually don't think it's so exceptional. You know, there are many neighborhoods in Seattle that are not the hipster neighborhoods. They're just regular neighborhoods in the suburbs and in downtown that have adjusted to this. Barbershops, and you know, it's not been that businesses are closing down. We're still experiencing the increases, but so far there's no indication that that actually happened. San Francisco, you know, also has a very high wage economy, has passed ordinances to pay wages. They haven't experienced that. Chicago, they're in the past to 13. They're not experiencing that. They're experiencing many other kind of problems of a nature that should be addressed too. But that is not the result of raising, you know, in the past to go to $13 an hour. And in LA, time will tell. But I doubt very much that you're going to see a hemorrhage of business. Are there adjustments? Are there winners and losers? Yes, there are. But they're winners and losers right now out of the inaction that we do. You know, Jamil, I don't consider him a loser, but he struggles because there is not a minimum that can help him and his coworkers, right? If we don't do anything of significantly raising wages, he'll be losing. But his loss is not counted because it's already taken as a given fact. I mean, EJ referred to the increasing cost in childcare, which I think is something that we should look at and work on the social service providers, the nonprofits. It's very important to figure out how they fit in this equation. But we also are ignoring that raising the minimum wage will help many families being able to afford childcare in the first place, who can no longer afford it because they earn too little. So we have to look at kind of both sides, and I think that all too often we like to keep everything constant in the analysis and just look at that variable that we are advocating for. To me, the best experience is the one that really happens in the real world. I haven't seen a single reference study or discussion within the family of SEIU. I leave the studies for the policymakers that suggest that the sky is going to fall. That there will be adjustments that need to be done, I'm sure. And we're smart enough, and we have a democratic system that will be able to respond to whatever changes might be necessary, but not taking the risk. I think that is wrong. And I think the level of the problem that we face is unprecedented. And, you know, sort of like piecemeal approaches to addressing income inequality no longer work. If we only use piecemeal approaches, the gap, the need will not be to raise the minimum wage to 15, it will become then 25. And then what are we going to do? Raise it $10? Raise it $9? You know, like, we are still within that, I would say, window of opportunity that raising it to 15 will give us a platform to then consider future increases on whatever, you know, math we want to use to secure decent wages. If we miss this window, the window is getting narrower and narrower and narrower, and it's going to become more of a social problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Perkins.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you also. In listening, you talked about poetry, you talked about prose turning into poetry, you talked about mathematics, and then most importantly, you talked about the morality that has been brought to this conversation by resurrecting the name of Dr. King. So I want to thank you for that. La lucha continúa.
La lucha continúa.
Gracias.
Hector, great to see you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Jamil, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for putting me just before lunch, because it helped us make our remarks quick and short. Thank you.
Next we have Ken Pekalski, who's the Vice President for the Business Council of New York State. Ken, good to see you.
Good morning, or good afternoon, and I guess we still say Happy New Year.
Yes.
Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I think I've interacted with you all before. You know I enjoy a robust conversation, so appreciate the opportunity. The Business Council, I think you know, but I don't know if everyone in the room knows, we're a statewide 100-year-old employer association. We represent about 2,400 companies that employ about 1 million people in New York State. About 80% of our membership are small business employers of 100 or less, and quite a number of them are much smaller than 100. And within our membership, we have 60 local chambers of commerce located across the state whose membership is primarily small business. This fall, as I do most years, I get out of Albany, I meet with our membership, including our chamber members. Now, I have no illusion that I would win the applause test that Mr. Grisham suggested earlier today. But on Monday, as an example, I was in a room about this size with about 150 chamber members, mostly small business owners, and people who ran non-for-profit. And frankly, this was the only issue they wanted to talk about. We were there to give a forecast or preview of the 2016 legislative session. This is the only thing they want to talk about. And I'll tell you, they're quite nervous about the potential impact of a $15 an hour minimum wage. So in response to the request to talk about the economic context and the economic impact, that's the perspective I want to share with you today. I'm not going to read my testimony. I'm going to bounce around. I'll probably get lost once or twice, so bear with me. But here goes. As you have said, governor's projection of the impact of $15 fully implemented is just under $16 billion a year. So let me put that into perspective of our membership, who has been advocating for a more competitive, less costly business climate in New York State. We've done some useful things the last several years. Through restructuring of UI taxes, we've saved about $200 million in aggregate statewide in UI taxes interest costs in repaying a federal debt. Caveat, we had to raise taxes by $3 billion because that was our federal borrowing, but there was cost savings there, $200 million. That's great news. In 2014, the governor proposed, you adopted with broad bipartisan support, business corporate tax reform, bank tax reform that once fully implemented in 2016 is a business tax reduction of about $600 million a year. Again, from our perspective, good news. Real property tax cap, the aggregate value since its inception to commercial, industrial, utility, property taxpayers in aggregate, add up all the years together, is probably about $1 billion a year so far. But that's all the years added up together. As we heard earlier this year, the governor will be proposing about a $300 million a year additional small business tax reduction in his 2013-14 or 2017 executive budget. These are all positive steps in our view in improving the state's business climate, but their aggregate value would be absolutely dwarfed by the impact of this proposed minimum wage increase. By the way, if it's being pegged at about $16 billion a year, the total property taxes paid in New York State any given year by all commercial, industrial, and utility property owners is about $15 billion. So if you want to do an offset, you could repeal all property taxes. Point is, you really can't do an offset. There's no feasible way to do that. The other thing our members like to remind people, remind policymakers in Albany, is that New York is an expensive place to do business. And by the way, New York is a leader in increasing its minimum wage. At $9 an hour, we're exceeded only by 8 states. There's 2 states right now at $10 an hour. Some smaller states, Alaska and Vermont, at $9.75 and $9.60. Oregon's at $9.25, Connecticut at $9.15. We joined a few other states at $9. We're 25% above the national level. So we are a leader among states. And even with this recent activity, we're seeing other states adopting higher minimum wage. No state that I'm aware of is seriously considering going to $15 like we are here. And questions were asked to the last witness about what's happening at localities that are moving towards 15. I didn't have my chart with me this morning, but most, particularly the West Coast cities who are adopting a step up to 15 aren't anywhere close yet. They're closer to where we are now. They're in the $10 to $11 range. And we're already seeing, it's too early to tell, it really is, but you saw an immediate reduction in restaurant jobs in Seattle right after the first step increase there. It's recovered a bit. You're seeing some numbers coming out of Los Angeles County, which for hospitality industry, I believe they went immediately to $15 an hour. And you're seeing a significant reduction in, or the start of reduction in hotel jobs in Los Angeles County. So the lesson there from these other jurisdictions is, one, it's too soon to tell. Two, they're not anywhere close to $15 yet. But some of the job numbers are certainly raising concerns. Next point, looking at the impact on an employer. When we went to $9 an hour, effective just several days ago, compared to the federal minimum wage, when you count direct cost of wages, things that will go up automatically, federal withholdings, workers' compensation costs, which are pegged to wages, that's just about $4,000 per year per FTE for the employer, compared to $7.25. When we go if we were to go from $9 an hour to $15 an hour, that's an additional $13,400 in change per job per year. 13,400 going to 15, compared to the federal minimum wage, and some of our members do compete with the national businesses. That's a $17,300 difference per job per year. These are real numbers. We find it hard to take seriously an argument that the typical employer can absorb wage increases, and for many employers, wages are their largest cost of doing business, without any significant adverse impact. And it's true, when we did the minimum wage bill in 2013, relatively few New Yorkers were making the minimum wage of $7.25. Federal data for that year showed about 200,000 people out of a workforce of a little over 7 million were making $7.25. People weren't at the minimum wage. As you go higher, and as E.J. McMahon presented his data earlier, in labor markets, particularly in labor markets upstate New York, where the median wage today isn't much over 15. In some places, it's not over 15. As you approach that, a $15 minimum wage is impacting far more positions, far more employers, and far more jobs. As a matter of fact, some data we looked at, out of 785 occupational categories tracked by the Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics, over 150 of them have median wages under $15 an hour. And I think people expect that to affect sectors like retail, food service, health and social service. It's also directly impacting a diverse range of occupations, everything from pharmacy aides to electronic equipment assemblers, industrial truck contractor operators, and others. Point being, $15 minimum wage has an enormous impact in New York State labor markets, particularly in upstate New York, and will affect many sectors that you're probably not thinking when you talk about increases in the minimum wage. Now, people have talked about what the minimum wage would be if it kept up with inflation, and any number of ways to look at it. We've looked at it as well. New York State adopted its first numeric minimum wage of $1 an hour in 1960. Adjusted for inflation today, it's well under $9 an hour. It's way under. It's about half of $15 an hour. But to me, that's not the most important comparison to make. I think what you really need to look at is what wages are in the regions of New York State. Median wages in New York City are far higher than most parts of upstate New York. The median wages in the labor markets differ dramatically. And the thought that a $15 an hour minimum wage, even if it was delayed by a couple of years, would have no adverse impact on upstate jobs, we think is missing the point. the last point I'm going to make is that, we represent for-profit business. We also have within our membership and then through our chamber network a lot of not-for-profits, social service entities, and employers who work with those.
Okay, good.
Employers who work with those social service agencies to place, to do workforce development, to place at-risk youth in their first jobs. And we're hearing a significant concern there that those efforts will have a double negative effect here. First, the social service agencies themselves will see a significant cost in doing business. And second, the types of jobs that they're trying to place at-risk youth into will be difficult to find if the wage mandate goes from $9 an hour to $15 an hour in a relatively short period of time. Now, the Business Council is a member of an organization we've called Minimum Wage Reality Check. That's a coalition of us and about 30 other chambers, business trade associations, agricultural organizations, and others who've come together to make sure that the administration, the legislature, and the general public hears the economic context and the economic concerns that employers have about proposals to increase the minimum wage, whether it's to $15 an hour or something different. We do think that all of the above, the executive, the legislature, and the general public need to know, and I think they will respond to the types of concerns that we're raising. We do think this will have an adverse effect, have a particularly adverse effect in labor markets where median wages are not high, and communities, frankly, are still struggling to recover jobs lost in the 2008 recession. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony today. Welcome any questions or comments you have.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What's the minimum wage in California?
I believe the statewide minimum wage is $10 an hour today.
And in Texas? Do you know?
I believe Texas tracks the federal minimum wage of
$7.25?
I believe so.
I'm just,
About 22 states do not have a state minimum wage, so they're subject to federal $7.25.
As we consider this issue, and I appreciate the differences and the different perspectives, and for me, it's a question of jobs and how do we keep the jobs we have? How do we encourage people to invest in this state and bring jobs with them? And are we saying that if there's a $10 job out there working in a manufacturing job that's being provided in Massachusetts or New Jersey or Pennsylvania, that we don't want those jobs here in New York? I mean, is that what a public policy like this says, that those jobs aren't good enough for us, so we don't want New Yorkers doing those jobs, or so that they should take those jobs to other states and provide those jobs and opportunities elsewhere? Because there's a consequence, because we're not in this alone. This is not just us. We have other states around us, and many of those jobs and manufacturers and businesses that we try to attract to our state will simply go elsewhere. Have you calculated the effect of that of a significant minimum wage increase on that?
Well, we know this, that, because I just ran these numbers yesterday, since 1990, and we know that manufacturing in the U.S. isn't what it used to be. Since 1990, the U.S. has lost roughly 30% of its manufacturing employment. Over that period of time, New York State has lost about 54% of its manufacturing employment. 500,000 manufacturing jobs we don't have today that we had in 1990. New York City, by the way, has lost 71%. New York City is lost its manufacturing base. The median wage in production work in manufacturing statewide right now is about $17 an hour. These are the jobs, quite frankly, the advocates are begging for. Above $15 an hour. These are the jobs the entry is, these are not engineering positions. These are floor production jobs, median about $16 an hour, $17 an hour. Our concern, over time, New York State has become a high cost of doing business state until the natural gas boom dramatically changed in energy markets in New York. We were historically the most expensive place for electric power. Manufacturing is power intensive. We remain, or we become again, one of the highest workers' comp cost states in the nation. We are for manufacturing, the highest cost real property tax. We have a lot of headwinds to our manufacturing base. And those are the reasons cumulatively why we've been losing manufacturing jobs at almost double the national rate for 2 generations. I think the better, more sustainable approach to addressing the need for quality jobs is to make sure we're attractive to retaining and creating quality jobs, not taking jobs that are inherent in low margin industries and mandate that the wages go up to a point where we don't think they're going to be sustainable.
You know, one of the issues that's come up as we've held hearings on increasing on workforce development and training is that there are areas of the state where there are mid-skill level jobs available, but simply not the skills able to provide them. How do we factor in other aspects, for offsetting increased wages with increased training opportunities to allow those opportunities? Is that something that you've had an opportunity to look at? Sure,
and we're working on a manufacturing-specific legislative agenda that we'll be announcing in a couple weeks. One of the things we hear all the time is how do you make the connection between people looking to get these jobs and making sure they have the skills needed. We have a couple relatively small state programs that provide funding for either incumbent worker training to upgrade their skills or to tailor job training to meet the specific needs of an employer. These, in a state budget of $140 billion, give or take, these are single-digit $1 million a year programs. We think we're going to highlight some of those specific programs where we think some additional funding is going to help create pathways for people who need to upgrade skills to take jobs that are naturally higher paying than you might find in the retail or food service industry.
As we discuss numbers, lots of numbers, and we throw numbers around and percentages and median wages, and we talk about job losses in the hundreds of thousands. Again, when I sit down with my business community, with my chambers of commerce, with my small businesses, even as I walk around my own community and partake in wherever I happen to be going, there's a real concern out there among small businesses that there could be devastating consequences. I'm sure that they have reached out to you and that you've heard from your own constituents. What are they telling you?
I'll give you some examples. When I was in Central New York Monday, talked to a person who's got her business plan written. She's doing sort of a high school tutorial business, and she said $15. She's paying her retained educators $15 an hour in her business plan. She said with support staff costs approaching $15 an hour, I'm not going to open a business. That's just one example. What we hear, and we hear concerns like that from businesses large and small. We know if you go to restaurants and retail stores, you're seeing automation at the front end. That's probably regardless of what the minimum wage is, that's something you're going to see. You're seeing businesses looking at ways to mitigate labor costs. You're looking at business, we're meeting with someone tomorrow who, just with the fast food minimum wage coming into effect, they're asking us what advice we have for dealing with wage differentials between what their current labor rates are and what they're going to be competing with in other sectors. So it comes in all shapes and forms, but generally speaking, for people who are directly affected by it and will be indirectly affected by it, it's just a concern. They said, well, many of them will figure out a way to survive. It'll be with different, their business plans will change, their employment numbers may change, the hours available may change, prices will change, but there's almost a universal concern.
The governor has suggested that there'll be tax breaks for businesses to offset a minimum wage increase. And you know, I agree, anybody who takes a moment to actually analyze that out just understands that it's not possible to absorb that nearly $16 billion. We just don't have the ability in the state budget to absorb that. Increased wages are a cash flow issue. You pay wages every week or every 2 weeks. Tax breaks are something you take at the end of the year if, in fact, you have net profits to take a break against. What would you suggest would be factors that we could consider that would offset any minimum wage increase, and whether it's to whatever number? How should we be approaching if, in fact, there is going to be a minimum wage increase, considering offsetting the impacts to small businesses in a meaningful way?
Well, we think there's things the state should do, regardless of what you do with the minimum wage, that would make New York State a little bit more easy place to do business. We need to rein back in the cost of workers' comp. You do that in ways to making the process work better. We adopted, for example, durational caps on permanent partial disability benefits. But what was supposed to be a 10-year cap on benefits, as a practical matter, is like a 16-year cap because the process doesn't move you to classification. That would be a significant cost savings in workers' compensation. You mentioned paid weekly or biweekly. We're one of the few states, perhaps the only state, that still has a weekly pay mandate. It doesn't affect a lot of employers or a lot of employees, quite frankly, but for employers who are affected by it, it's another sort of oddball thing you have to pay money in for New York State. If you're in a national payroll system, you're cutting weekly checks for a small portion. When we restructured the UI tax rates in 2013 to generate some short-term revenue increases necessary to repay the federal government, we lopped off the tax rates that reflected the good performance of employers that don't do a lot of layoffs. That was a significant increase in cost to those very employers that we should want to have in New York State. We can put those back in the tax table. They only become effect when the UI fund is solvent enough. We could do the small business tax cut that the governor's proposed. We would tweak it a little bit, but we think it's a great start. There's any number of things like that. There is over $1 billion a year. If you look at your energy rates, 20 to 25% of what you pay is paying agency-imposed assessments on energy, supposedly to support various green energy or efficiency or whatnot. But it's 20% of every utility dollar you pay. Let's look at whether that money is being spent wisely and whether we should be imposing those types of additional costs on energy-intensive businesses. So there's any number of things we could do. Regardless of what you do with the minimum wage, we think these other things should be under consideration by the legislature.
But especially if we're discussing a minimum wage.
Sure.
Senator Savino.
Thank you, Senator Martins. Thank you, Ken, for your testimony. I'm not surprised that the Business Council is opposed to raising the minimum wage. I'm not surprised employers don't want to pay higher costs. Nobody wants to pay higher anything. If we propose raising income taxes, nobody wants to pay it. Nobody ever wants to pay more. But the reality is employers in this state are facing this issue or other issues that are going to require them to pay out more to compensate workers. One of the things I'm curious about, though, is if you're a business in New York State, how do you determine what the rate of compensation should be? How does someone go about deciding what you should pay an employee?
There's really two factors, two
Okay.
major factors. It is what is the current labor market and is what's your ability to pay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so bearing those 2 points, the current labor market, and of course it's like others who are similarly situated, right? One of the other factors that I think many of you have to take into consideration if you want to be good employers, how do you recruit and retain employees to continue working for you if there are other places they could work? Oftentimes is your benefit packages. What I don't hear coming from employers is that one of the things that's led to wage depression or compression in many of these lower wage jobs is if you want to provide any level of benefits for your employee, those costs have gone up, and the Affordable Care Act hasn't actually reduced them that much yet. Do you think there should be a discussion about the cost of health care in this state to provide private health insurance as a package for employees?